Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. Night, November 21st, 2020. I had to look down because I figure it's like what, the 380th day of March, something like that. So, joining me, Tom Norman. How you doing, Tom?
Good, Kevin. Welcome, everyone, tonight.
Excellent. So the way that Shop Talk works is got a couple of themes, but if you have questions, if you have thoughts, comments, drop them in chat. This is mostly a chat-driven show, so we want that interaction. Looking forward to it. Or just the one person. Yeah, so welcome the Duke. You are not alone. I think. There are certainly voices in my head. They may be in yours as well. So tonight, our first topic that we want to talk about is that Microsoft Ignite starts tomorrow. Pre-football show. The game that I cared about was yesterday. I don't even know who's playing tonight. All I know is 1 p.m. yesterday. By about 4:30, I was pretty happy. But Microsoft Ignite starts September 22nd, which is tomorrow based on my calendar. Runs through September 24th. And Tom, you said before the stream that you are registered for Ignite.
I am registered. I went out there and chose a few topics to kind of look at things, but we also discussed that as a DBA, there's not a lot of offering this year for us.
Yeah, let me drop the Ignite sessions in chat. So anybody who's interested, check those out. Registration for Ignite is free, is it not?
It is free, so there's no cost. It's more or less just having the time to listen to the sessions. It's interesting because you can go throughout the 3-day conference and the session is kind of replayed. I don't know whether it's just a actual replay and not really live at that point, but you can catch it at all different times. And the one thing I found interesting this year, Kevin, was like I'm looking at one that I'm looking at is archive resiliency with security, compliance, and identity. And the session's only 20 minutes long. So one, I'm glad I'm not a speaker because that would definitely be kind of hard to put stuff into. But at the other hand, as a listener, if I'm working during the day, I might be able to take 20 minutes and listen to something.
That's a fair point, yeah. And it looks like most of the sessions tend to be this year around 30 minutes long. So 20, 30. The Duke mentions Ignite has always felt like Ignite has always been about BI folks, and that's a big part of it. I mean, it's fundamentally it's a developer conference. So if you are an administrative person, there are possibly some sessions, especially if you live in Azure, you do administration in Azure, like working in network infrastructure in Azure. Yeah, you'll get some sessions. But if you're an application developer or a BI professional, definitely I think you'll get more out of it. I took a look at the key themes in data, and there's an entire track that's dedicated to Power Platform. So everything in Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power whatever they're calling it these days, available to you. Pretty good number of sessions. In the data space, actually, it was funny that the session that seems like it has the most runs is migrating .NET apps to Azure. That's in the data space. So I understand that it involves taking databases on-prem and putting into Azure SQL database, and I'm sure that there will be some pieces on that, but that's a web application. Like, that's a developer session. In the data space, then there's Azure Arc, which Arc's an interesting concept. It's just every time somebody starts to explain it to me, my brain shuts off and says, you don't really need to know about this. The really high level point, the part that I get before my brain shuts off and tells me I don't need to learn more about it, is that Arc is kind of intended as a, say, a portal for various types of clouds, including local clouds, which sounds like a little bit of a contradiction in terms, but you can think about it as I can have a Kubernetes cluster running on premises. I could have it running in Azure, in AWS. I could have it running in Rackspace if I wanted to pay extra for that. Have it running in all different types of places, but having a central management functionality. So being able to use that Azure portal and possibly being able to do things like chargebacks for departments. So if you have one department, you could say you can host it in Azure for the price in Azure. You can host it in AWS for the price in AWS. You could host it locally for this price, and let different departments choose where they're going to host it, what those trade-offs might look like, what services they're going to host. So that really high-level concept of how it can work is pretty cool. And then I just shut my brain off when they start talking implementation, because like, I don't know about any of this.
Yeah, you would have to be in, I think, a fairly large shop to be so diverse and have so
Oh
many
yeah.
different clouds running. I know that, like my shop, is fairly small, and we're trying, when we migrate next year, it's pretty much, we're going to stay along the lines of Azure. We're not going to be going, we need some in Azure, we need some in AWS, and we need some in, Google Cloud, whatever the case may be.
Right. Right. Yeah. This is, I can see that more on, here's the enterprise level. This is for mega organization that has 8 different offices in 7 countries and hires 10,000 people.
Right.
So the Duke
Yeah.
mentions. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
The other part would be, of course, if you're also a company that has bought company after bought company after bought company like we have, and you step in, okay, this one's using MySQL, this one's using, we do have some stuff out on AWS because we purchased some companies that have stuff out on AWS, but I think we're migrating it all to Azure.
Yeah. When you have multi-cloud experiences, so I'm vaguely curious about the Arc session, because what Microsoft has made public is sort of the aspirations of Arc, and what's available today is early beginning, but it kind of feels like it's going to be years before you get to that aspirational level.
Is it the beta 1 that they're wanting you to go out there and tell them everything that's wrong with it and experience all the issues they have?
Yeah, maybe. That's kind of the norm for cloud services at this point.
Yep.
Throw it out and let customers beta test. That's not really a knock at Microsoft. Everybody does that. You do as much testing as you can get away with, but just gotta push the next feature out as fast as you can. So the Duke
Right.
mentions, when you see topics about code, it's all low code. Things like Power Automate. Yeah, would love to see some stats on their code sessions, anything to do with coding, and how many of them involve low code solutions. Probably quite a bit, because it's really easy to get somebody in the door on that. It's hard to walk through a code heavy session, and it's not just a Microsoft thing. I attended several sessions remotely for Spark AI Summit, and even the stuff that is, heavy in code still wasn't really that much code. They showed a couple dozen lines of code. Just like Ignite, Spark AI Summit had about 20-30 minutes per session. So there's only so much you can do. And it's it's easier to say, well, look, here's a real quick interface where you can click a couple of buttons and now you have a chatbot. Like, yeah, that chatbot doesn't really do much. It's not that useful, but it was easy for me to demonstrate. If you want to extend it at all, now you're talking about the much code solution as opposed to the low code solution, and that's going to take a couple of months and a few thousand lines of code, and that's not going to work very well in a 20 to 30 minute session. So Andreessen Horowitz, low code is all about low code, and so it's a lot of research coming from Gartner saying that low code platforms will have a huge increase in the next few years.
Okay.
I won't dispute that.
I would.
You would, Tom?
Yeah, because over the career, as you can see, I'm kind of gray-headed and stuff. Over my career, Microsoft's always been trying to code out the developer to where, things are just really easy and just anybody can do it. And we're not there yet. And I've been doing this for over 30 years. So
Yeah, I guess part of it might be getting into definitional on what does low code mean. Is it not many lines of code? Is it strictly bounding the interface for what you can do? Is it using languages that are not regular programming languages? Like if I have to write several hundred lines of JavaScript, is that still low code? Because, well, that was just for the visualization. I'm not sure.
it's another one of those marketing terms to try to sell something, I believe.
Maybe. So low code can plug into APIs like cognitive services. That might not be one session of training, but in two it could be done. You can. So yeah, you can do a legitimate development session definitely within an hour. I mean, we see that quite frequently at the user group level. And tying into cognitive services, that was mentally a little bit of where I was going with the low code solution. That this is 5 lines of using a pre-trained model in cognitive services and taking a feed of something that's already been created, and look, I've got my result in just 5 lines of code. And then you say, well, now I need to add in Active Directory authentication. Now I need to add in connections to my database. I need to add in accessing this information, processing the information, doing all this other stuff, and suddenly you have 55 files of several thousand lines of code and a much larger project.
Talking to your encryption of how to get in there and access your encrypted data.
Yeah, exactly. That the kernel of it, you can hit that. It is an API. You can hit that very easily. You can perform the operation as long as you stay down that happy path. If you need to do something else, you need to say use a model that's not trained in cognitive services. Or something that's not available in cognitive services, that also puts you off of that low code happy path. So, I mean, I think I understand where you're coming from with the idea, and certainly things have gotten a lot easier. The idea that I can get to a pre-trained neural network model and perform image recognition pretty quickly. That's nice. Now, if that solves my problem, I'm in good shape. That was pretty easy. But if that doesn't quite solve my problem, now I've got a bit more work ahead of me. And I can see them trying to get everything to the happy path, but I don't see it really happening. And Solomon says, similar to the recurring theme of the next version of SQL Server or SSMS will be so automated or easy it'll put DBAs out of a job.
Yeah.
That was SQL Server 2000. SQL Server 2000 was so easy. It had so much intelligence built in that you really didn't need a DBA.
And that's why us DBAs, when we walk into a shop like that, we just kind of just shake our head and go, thank you very much for all the money you're paying me to straighten up this mess that you've created.
Eh. But that's been something that Microsoft has pushed for decades. I mean, I played the straight man on 2000, but seriously, some of the early advertising for SQL Server 2000 was you're not going to need a DBA anymore because SQL Server will just take care of itself. And obviously didn't happen. Even stuff that is coming in, the automation does come in. I appreciate it. I've grown to like the say automatic plan correction, the automatic looking at indexes, because it's a lot better than DTA. It's much more careful about creating indexes, but I do
until
appreciate.
it brings your database to its knees during the middle of the day because you can't schedule it in Azure SQL DB.
All right, well, there's a problem.
My contract I worked on, that's exactly what happened. Is all of a sudden, wham! It says I need to build an index, and it's 2:30 in the afternoon, and it brings the database to a standstill because it's on the biggest table in the database.
Yep. By the way, Mike, I see your comment. What you're saying here actually ties into another theme for tonight, so I'm kind of holding on it for now, so that I can bring it up in a little bit. You've pre-anticipated us. It was well done. So yeah, that's a problem, and dealing with that problem is something that can happen over time. But one of the interesting things about automation is it seems like automation always brings or opens up the door to more complexity. Like there's no final
Now,
door.
wait a minute. Wait a minute. In Azure SQL DB, it's check a box. How much more complex is that, except that they forget to allow you to schedule it and say, don't do it between these hours.
Yeah. Well, you can close down complexity in some areas. Complexity opens up in other areas.
Yes.
Um,
We forget
so
the simple things when we try to code people out of things. We forget the simple things like that should be thought of.
well, even then, even if you figure out all the simple things, you get all of those. There's gonna be the
There's
next
something
door.
else.
Yeah, there's
Yeah, there's gonna be
always.
something else.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily caused by the automation. Quite often, it's not caused by the automation. It's just that as a human, I didn't even think about this bit before because I didn't have time to. I was so focused on this previous thing. Once I've automated it, oh, well, guess what? Now I have these problems to deal with. So
Yep.
it's,
Thus, they'll never get rid of DBAs.
yeah, which is a different debate, but it just seems to come back up and up again. So that was Azure Arc. Synapse Analytics, they are talking a bit about that. Synapse is kind of in an interesting place. So if you're not too familiar with it, you remember Azure SQL Data Warehouse, MPP SQL Server. That has been renamed as Azure Synapse Analytics SQL Pools. In addition to that, you have Azure Synapse Analytics Spark Pools, which are using the open source version of Spark, not the Databricks enhancements. And in addition to that, you have SQL on demand or SQL serverless. So you can query data, say, from Azure Blob Storage or Azure Data Lake Storage, and build external tables on that and query that data whenever you need to, or pull it in from some other external source, and usually in Parquet format. But querying that data as as needed. The servers don't exist until you run the query, and you get charged by the number of terabytes of data read. So gives you kind of an idea of what your costs look like, but just kind of an idea until you see the bill.
I guess if you put Entity Framework in front of that, you're going to have a huge bill, huh?
Yes, you would. One of the areas where I've seen serverless work pretty well with Synapse is actually feeding into Power BI. So either directly or going into Azure Analytics Services, Azure Analysis Services, and then into Power BI. But that idea where I only need to import it once in a while, I can schedule my data loads, and I know that the data doesn't change that frequently. So maybe I load it once a week, and then I can scan my data, write a query, load it in. Wouldn't necessarily work too well for regular application calls because there is some spin up time. If you're willing to wait, if it's for reporting, for example, where if it takes 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds to run, that's not the end of the world. Then serverless can work pretty well, and it can churn through a lot of data in that time. If you need something that returns back in milliseconds because it's populating a drop-down list, I don't think I would want to use serverless for that. I also would not want to use Synapse Analytics for that. That's definitely not the right place for it. But it does become interesting that there are so many different variations, flavors of SQL Server floating around in Azure and on premises that all seem like they serve overlapping purposes. Everything from our SQL Server box product to Azure SQL Database, as Tom mentioned, managed instances, Synapse SQL pools, big data clusters, and Azure SQL Database Edge, or Azure SQL Edge, excuse me.
I was going to say, you almost skipped Edge there.
Yeah. And I'm probably missing 2 or 3 other variants that are relatively important. And
Azure SQL Server Web Edition.
Well, I considered that on premises.
Okay.
It may not be available. The licensing around that was pretty weird. Like you can get it in RDS, or excuse me, you can get it in actually in RDS and select Web Edition there. I think you may be able to get it in Azure.
You were.
There's supposed to be a way that you can do it on premises, I think, but that goes into licensing, and I don't know anything.
Well, first of all, don't even do it because it's so limited and restricted. You don't, you can't do anything with it. That was my experience with it.
It's basically for running a website. You need a website for your database.
Yeah.
You need a database for your website. But you
they
can't
were
do
using
anything
it for
with the database.
They were using it for their production database.
Yeah, so my recollection was you're not supposed to do anything with the database directly. It has to everything go through the web application. And you're not supposed to use any services to connect to it other than the website.
Well, I guess they plunked that one before I came in.
I don't ask too many questions. That's licensing. I don't know licensing.
Yeah.
Just use CE or MSDE. There you go. Viable clan member. That seems legit. File system for your database. SQLite can do a lot of great things.
File stream.
File tables. I think file table is wildly underrated.
Yes, it is.
File stream, no, I didn't like file stream very much. File table did a really good job. Still doesn't work on Linux as I recall, but if you had that scenario where I need to see what data is in, I need to be able to read files. I need to be able to see listings of files without storing the files in SQL Server directly. Just put it on a network share. Let me connect to that, and let me get metadata, file sizes, file types, file names, be able to query that. It works really well.
Yeah,
And yeah, SQLite's really useful. It's incredibly useful in the mobile world. It's very low uh, low requirement. It is a
Would
quick way to
you
store data.
would now that SQL Edge is out, would you actually use Edge on the mobile device? That's an interesting concept. Except will it work with an ARM processor?
So, Azure SQL Edge works with ARM processors. If I remember right, specific ARM processors. You have to be running a 64-bit version of Linux, which means that your ARM processor must support 64-bit. So some of the lower end ARM processors are 32-bit only. Some of the operating systems for ARM, like even Raspbian's 32-bit, which is why Azure SQL Edge doesn't support Raspbian. You have to flash that Raspberry Pi and install Ubuntu or some other Linux variant. So yeah, if you're using an ARM processor that supports 64-bit, is running a supported version of Linux, and can run Docker or Moby, then yeah, you could use Azure SQL Edge on the device. There are licensing restrictions on what is allowed. So what you're allowed to use Azure SQL Edge on, because the pricing for it is a bit different than on-premises SQL Server. So you can't just say, well, this application, this blade in my ESX host is it's IoT. It's on the internet and it's a thing. So I want to pay the Azure SQL Edge pricing. They have some restrictions on what constitutes a valid device. But if you had a Linux-based phone, that would work. If you have a device that houses a Raspberry Pi, or that houses an ARM processor that can run Linux, yeah, that'll work. You could install Azure SQL Edge on there. So Synapse Analytics, there's some on Delta Lake with Databricks, and over in the AI world, there are also some sessions on Databricks in general when working with machine learning. Several Databricks sessions, which look pretty interesting. Azure Database for MySQL and Postgres gets pretty high billing, which, okay, I'm oh, I doesn't I can't really get much feeling for that. I can't get much behind it. I'm certainly not opposed to the idea. Like, if you want to run MySQL or Postgres in a cloud, there are plenty of companies who do this. There are plenty of companies who run MySQL and Postgres. From a business standpoint, makes a lot of sense. Personally, just doesn't move the needle for me. If I were a regular MySQL developer, or frequently use Postgres, I'd probably complain that the versions in Azure are way out of date. But conceptually, I'd probably be a lot more interested than I am being me.
There's one out there, Kevin, that might be interested some folks to see what Microsoft thinks about the future of work. How are we going to work, and what's it going to look like a decade from now, and the risks and the trends, and we're going to now that with COVID and all that kind of stuff, and so many people being home and employee well-being, it's going to be interesting to see what their projections are as far as what it's going to look like.
That will be interesting. My first prediction is that Teams still won't work 10 years from now.
Come on, you don't like Teams?
It's funny where there are some features in Teams that are really nice. Live captions. I use live captions quite frequently. and they're not perfect, but they pick up quite a few different types of accents. I've done live captions with groups of people, actually all across the world, um, East Asia, South Asia, Europe, the Americas. It does a good job of captioning people. Haven't tried it with
What do
my
you
dad. My dad is the best use case ever for any sort of automated intelligence speech to text because nothing can understand him. He's not
when
that
you talk
difficult to understand, but machines cannot understand the words he says.
when you're talking about captioning, are you talking about translating or what?
No, no, captions. So like closed captions on a television,
Oh, okay.
you
The
can
words
enable
across.
that in a Microsoft Teams meeting. It's a preview feature, but it will take the bottom bar of your screen and have about 2 lines worth of text where it will actively uh, translate. It'll actively translate speech to text.
Now, when you say translate, would it go French to English
No, no, it would
or
just
English
show
to
the
Spanish?
no, it would show the language in itself. It would not try to then translate a person speaking French into English.
Now
Instead, it will.
that would be interesting if it would do that.
Yeah, I could see a service doing something like that. It would. The
You got
translations would
Google
be pretty ugly.
you got Google Translate that does it. They got their earphones, they're supposed to do it, earplugs.
Yeah, there are some services. There are even applications on your phone where you can do translation, basically AR style translation, where I hold my phone over something that's say a menu in Italian, and it'll translate everything to English for me in real time if you have internet access. So that kind of stuff can be on the table, but at least as far as I'm aware, all the conversations I had were in English, but I don't believe they do language translation. I believe it is just speech to text. But even that, when you're on a Teams meeting and somebody is mumbling or it's hard to hear them for whatever reason, turning on that live captions is pretty cool. Then at the same time, it turns out I have more than one account with Microsoft Teams, and yet I can't switch between them without signing out and signing back in on my desktop. I can do it on my phone, can't do it on the desktop.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and when
with live caption, it's going to be interesting because that that can open up a whole new door way to your deaf people that work for you, right? It's not gonna help your blind people yet, but it's definitely going to help the deaf people if you've got anybody that's or even going deaf. Some of us getting older and going deaf. It helps out.
sure. So looking at chat, Microsoft are rich enough. When will open source be ready for your area of industry? Not quite sure what the context is on that viable clan member. Have you seen JetBrains Space? I have not. Need to surreptitiously Google that while I'm answering other questions.
JetBrain, what?
JetBrains Space. So it looks like an integrated team environment, sort of like maybe. Gotta look at this. It kind of feels a little bit like
Huh.
some of the Atlassian products. Like I'm looking at it thinking, kind of feels like if you took a bunch of Atlassian plugins into Slack, and you had Jira and you had Fisheye and Crucible in a
Yeah.
product with a bit of integration with Slack. It's kind of interesting. But no, I was not familiar with that before. Mike asks, have you heard about moderated meetings where computer conference and a voting system? No, I've not, but I can see the concept. I mean, we have this kind of going back to shoot. I can think Slashdot in the mid '90s, where you had the voting system, where if you got below 0, your comments were still there, but they were generally hidden from people. So conceptually, it seems like it's not that far of a stretch. Automatic minutes and tasks from the meeting using AI would be cool. Yes, automatic minutes would be kind of nice. I could see that even being not incredibly difficult because they store the transcripts, or excuse me, they could store the transcript as text files locally. I don't think they do today. There would be some cleanup required because speech to text is not perfect. It is interesting watching it because you can say a word that is kind of similar to another word, and speech to text initially may think that you said word X, but then in context with other words, it'll go back and say, oh, it had to actually have been Y because these are the words that followed it. So that is a fairly impressive feat in the model, that it will go back and it will modify the expected word choice based off of future words. So it's not just a what did it sound like right here and stream of translation. It even has sort of a backward looking effect. So some transcript or some type of minutes could be possible, but I think there'd be some effort in trying to turn that into human usable, something that's human usable afterwards. Automatic volume normalization would be good. Yeah, yeah. I remember that back in the '90s, Magnavox used to market televisions where they had automatic volume normalization because you'd have the show,
Commercials.
which tends to be pretty quiet, and then you go to the commercial where it's some guy screaming. And they would do that on purpose with the advertisements. They would purposefully record at levels that are higher than what the shows normally were to try to get your attention. Is text to speech based on the Dragon Dictates engine? No, it works. That's a little bit mean toward Dragon. Dragon's all right. I wouldn't bet my life on it, but if you limit yourself to vocabulary and language which is fairly generic and speak in a relatively slow, fairly consistent manner, Dragon can work pretty well. It's when you don't necessarily follow all of its dictates that it kind of falls apart. Or at least last time I used it, it did. But that's also been several years ago. So, last data theme, Azure SQL Edge. I'm legitimately excited about Azure SQL Edge. Not just because I'm doing a pre-con on that for Past Summit, and so I should hope that I'm excited. But I can see this being incredibly useful in IoT devices. Being able to have a local database on pretty much any sort of device, as long as it can run 64-bit Linux and has something like 2 gigs of RAM. So something that's extremely cheap, no, but that next level up, even a Raspberry Pi 4, not even the Pi 4B, just a regular Pi 4 could run Azure SQL Edge. I could see this being quite nice. It's going to allow for integration with Onyx. So I can train a model, an Onyx model, and ship that file down to my devices, use the predict function in Azure SQL Edge to generate predictions, scoring based off of that model. You wouldn't necessarily train on the IoT device, but you can use models on the IoT device. Also, I'm hopeful that the time series work that they're putting into Azure SQL Edge makes its way into the on-premises product, because they are definitely taking a stab at InfluxDB and that time series database market with Azure SQL Edge. Um, so I'm gonna check that session out, see what things I need to quickly add to my pre-con so that I can be caught up on it. So next next thing on the list here is you had some Kerberos thoughts. Maybe a Kerberos question for the audience.
I do, and that question is, I know a lot of you will find it odd that myself being an encryption guy that loves encryption, I've actually never turned Kerberos on. I'm just now getting to a new server that we're getting ready to turn it on. And the question I have for you folks basically is, do you turn it on for the application service accounts, not necessarily the service account that's running SQL Server, but let's just say you have application A calling into the database. Are you using Kerberos when you connect there? Are you getting an SPN set up? Let's see what these guys come up with. Yes, no. Solomon, you ought to have one.
Putting our chat members on the spot, calling them out by name.
Yeah.
That's what we do here. That is, we told you it would be interactive or else.
But yeah, so it's kind of interesting is we do have it set it up today. We're actually, Kevin, we talked about if no one's done it yet, we're working on doing a rolling upgrade, as they call it, as I've seen some SQL HA call it. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to go from 2016, SQL Server 2016 to SQL Server 2019, and we want to do it via an availability group that basically we connect the two databases together, and then we just fail them over. We say, okay, we're going to go to from 2016 to 2019. We're going to fail it over. We have an issue. We might be able to fail it back, but from articles I've read, don't count on it. And then the other thing is that I noticed, Kevin, that we were talking about is that within the SQL Server land, you can actually go skip versions. Well, not with the OS, FYI, guys. Where our 2016 is on SQL Server 2012 R2, and we cannot move all the way up to Windows 2019. I'm sorry, I said 2012 Windows R2, not SQL Server. So you can't skip a Windows version like you can SQL Server.
Yeah, so Solomon says believes the SPN is for the database service account, that there wouldn't be separate SPN setups for reporting services, integration services, and other machine learning services and everything else. Which,
Apps, no apps.
yeah, I think it's a no. I think it's just the instance, the machine name. Like you set up the SPN for that machine,
Right. Cool.
but that's my vague recollection when having to deal with SPN errors. Usually I just see that when we have a Kerberos, like a double hop issue where
Right.
you're trying to
Exactly.
go through, and instead of using your Active Directory credentials, it tries NT anonymous login.
Right.
And
Exactly.
so I believe that is just all about setting up the SPN for at the machine level for the instance of SQL Server and not for the individual services.
So has anybody out in our community land done a rolling upgrade yet? Or is this going to be, am I going to be the blazing trailhead to do this rolling upgrade?
We've done rolling upgrades. Actually, we did one from 17 to 19, if I remember right, for production, so that we didn't have any downtime or any real
Right.
downtime.
Yeah, that's our goal basically, is that there would be no downtime, or 2 minutes, 1 minute, whatever it takes to fail it over.
Right. So yeah, upgrading upgrading versions. I know that we also did that going from 2016 to 2017 for some instances in order to minimize downtime there as well. So yeah, it's a viable technique.
Yeah, you just got to make sure that your OS is in line, is what I'm finding.
Right.
That
We didn't change the OS version, if I remember right, for those upgrades. We just stuck with the same version of Windows.
Yeah, and we're actually changing the version of Windows also.
Yeah, that's just more plates spinning, trying to keep them all going.
Right. Oh,
So
cool.
next thing I want to call out is, gotta paste a link. There is a relatively new Microsoft Cloud workshop. So the reason I want to mention this is because, what was it? A couple months ago, I think it was late July, I did a off the cuff talk going through modernization, and that has that was in progress of working on this cloud workshop. So it's out there, it's available in GitHub, Microsoft's repo. If you do want to try it out, go ahead, check it out, try it. If you do run into any problems, add GitHub issues. I'll probably end up being the one answering the questions, because that's kind of how things go. But that is a brand new workshop as of August, and walks you through a scenario taking a website that's running on premises using Postgres, more of a classical in-tier architecture for the site itself, and trying to turn it into an event system running in Azure with lots of various flavors of Cosmos DB containers driving event handling.
And Polybase?
There's no poly.
You didn't put any Polybase in there? You wrote the book and you didn't put any Polybase in there?
There might be I forget if there's any Polybase in reading data from Azure Synapse Analytics. I believe even then I did not use Polybase.
Oh, Kevin, that was supposed to be your bread and butter to push your book.
Well, I'm not going to reference the book in a Microsoft GitHub repo. It'd be a little bit too much on the nose. But do check that out. I know that when I gave the talk in July, there were some people who said, "Hey, I'd love to see this in a bit more detail." There were also people who said, "Oh my gosh, this is absurd. This is crazy." It got a little bit less crazy by the time we got to the final version of it, but don't worry, it's still like 8 kinds of crazy, just not 12 like in the original.
So is that part of Bob Ward's and Anna's Azure classes they've been holding? Is that part of it? Does that add to it?
So it's not related directly to the work that Bob and Anna have been doing, but it's kind of in a similar vein. So this is intended to be a trainer-led session where it takes about 4 hours or so to complete. You have about 1 hour of setup and roughly 3 hours of actual training, and walking through with assistance from people and getting to a point where you have a project that's completed.
Azure Labs. You could have it all set up for them.
Well, the setup is part of the service. It's also mostly cloud and serverless stuff.
Yeah.
Azure Labs won't help you very much here.
No.
But yeah, check that out. Now, going back to Mike's prescient comment from earlier. Comment on all conferences presented by almost everyone. There's usually a presentation with context and depth that could answer some questions. But if you get only the presentation, well, why would you want to watch that online? You could watch it at your own convenience on YouTube. The question is, haven't virtual meetings changed the need for conferences? it's almost impossible to get hours together now because I can just watch offline. And I think that's a great question. Not only because I have that on my agenda in a slightly different form, but that's a good question in general. So we are entering conference season for the data platform folks. Ignite is tomorrow, starts tomorrow. Past Summit is, well, let's do this in almost chronological order. SQL Bits beginning of October, so that's just a couple weeks away. You have Past Summit in November, Data Platform Summit December. You've got other conferences in between, Group Buy, Data Weekender, other things coming up. So when everybody's virtual, why would I choose one conference over another? We're all presenting similar material, so there will be differences, especially if you say Ignite versus Past Summit or Data Platform Summit. But if I'm saying here's SQL Bits, here's Past Summit, you have people who are presenting at both. They may not present the same session, but you're going to have people talking about administration topics, about development topics, about Power BI, Power Platform, about different components, different things. So why go to Past Summit over SQL Bits or vice versa? Why go to either of them when they're paid conferences, if there are free conferences and people are presenting basically the same thing? If everybody's virtual, does it actually make a difference at that point? And coming to Mike's point, why go to a conference at all if I can just watch it on YouTube? At that point, I can make my own conference.
Well, the only thing that I see is that especially going to a physical conference, it's going to be interesting going to Past Summit because I am going to Summit. Because the thing of it is normally I need something to totally break me away from work to be able to go, to a session or whatever, even if it's online or whatever. I know that over the years, like I've gotten the recordings or whatever the case may be for Summit. And at least for me, I'm busy enough with the work and stuff. I don't want to listen to them in my off time. I've got other things I want to do besides, learning more about what I do at work. There's football games, college football games, maybe I want to go bicycling or whatever the case may be. But
yeah, that's fair. And when you're at a conference, you can kind of dedicate yourself to that and say, I'm going to these sessions, I'm focusing on learning. After the end of a long day at work, even if you're in your own office instead of in the office, it's kind of difficult to get back on that grind.
I think the most important part of all of it, though, Kevin, is not the sessions themselves. It's the networking. It's being able to talk to people. It's being able to, hey, have you ever seen, as you and I discuss sometimes on this chat, hey, have you ever seen this particular issue? Like we're talking about Kerberos, right? That's just a hallway conversation
Yep.
that you have with someone when you're networking, when you can network. And if the platform is right, which supposedly PASS is going to have that type of capability, that's to me far more valuable than sitting through your session for 50 minutes.
Sure. By the way, an ability to ask a real question would be a great reason to be live, but how many meetings can you ask real questions in? Yeah, you're often limited to what can I type out. Occasionally, you'll have the ability to go on mic, but that often you're not going to see in a lot of conference scenarios, just because I don't necessarily want to be on the microphone. I don't want to just don't want to have that. And B, you're kind of rolling the dice when you open it up to just anybody to come on.
That's the
So,
best part of it. That's when you learn the most.
no, it's not the best. That's when you get chat roulette.
Ah,
Just gonna
I
leave that
guess I've
out
never
there.
had chat roulette in one of my sessions.
I would hope not. Um, I would sincerely hope not. Uh, so there is definitely a risk that you're not going to see in an in-person session because those people in person, you'll still get someone trying to hog the mic and spend 15 minutes clearing their throat before asking the question that doesn't make sense because it has nothing to do with the topic. You run that risk, especially at academic conferences. But
Yeah, yeah.
at least uh, it's a lower risk. Gone to panel
And
discussions and they take no audience questions, just pre-prepared Q&A. Why not just write a report? That's a good question. If you're going to have a panel, I can see it as you have a moderated panel, but and in that case it's a prepared session, it's a multi-speaker session. If you're treating it as Q&A, well, there should be questions. You certainly want to have enough questions in case your audience is a little gun shy and doesn't want to put anything in. But yeah, you're right. If it's supposed to be a question and answer session and all it is answering questions that somebody else has come up with beforehand, it's not a Q&A session at that point.
some of the best sessions that I've moderated as the past virtualization virtual chapter leader, group leader, is I'll bring, David Klee on normally. He's the one that, loves to do them. And we'll just have an hour long, nothing but questions and answers. And
Ask
we'll kind of get it prepped ourselves, to have some there just in case. But once we ask one or two, it seems like that the rest of the hour is just full. They just, here comes the questions.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it really helps the individual from the standpoint of asking the questions of what they're dealing with right now versus, oh, okay, this is something that's in the future. 2019, I might be using it in 3 years.
Right. Yeah, ask me anything's a good example of this.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
But
I think that we're still learning how to do virtual sessions effectively. We'll see
I,
how the
I wonder
conferences do.
I wonder what's going to happen now that all this virtualization is happening, all this virtual training and all this kind of stuff. If, like, let's just say that, okay, Summit goes off well this year, they're still around next year, and we do have a live Summit again. How is managers as a whole that say, even if they paid the $600 this year, $600 this year to go to past Summit, how are they going to see that from the standpoint of, you want to spend how many thousands of dollars to send me to X place to be able to go to a live conference?
Yeah, I mean that.
I could, I could actually see that maybe in the future that you have a live conference that's smaller, but at the same time, it's also a virtual live conference, kind of like past coming up, a combination, a hybrid.
Yeah, I it will be interesting. I mean, prior to this year, it was easy. You could say, well, it's a great place to get a lot of training. It's a great place to get focused in on this community, ask questions, talk to experts, talk to Microsoft, um, build those networking contacts for the managers who had enough foresight to realize that's a good thing for their employees. For the ones who weren't, you could still focus on, this in-depth training in a focused area with access to Microsoft, with access to product teams, with access to these things. So you could sell it that way. With everything being virtual this year, next year it might be difficult to sell that. You may
Yeah,
have
that's
to,
what I'm thinking.
yeah, you may have to focus on, well, the in-person contacts allow me to, hey, remember that one time when we had this error and I solved it in 10 minutes? That's because I know this guy who knew the answer immediately because I met him at Summit.
The other part of it is the cat. For me, the biggest thing that's at Summit and has been for the past few years is the cat team. And I utilize them probably every year for at least 2 or 3 questions. And no telling how much money they have saved the company of having to dial up and spend the $500 to get on there. And you got to get through level 1, level 2, level 3. Well, at CAT, you're at the main person, so you're not going through all these trying to get your answer through all these different levels.
True,
So,
true. So
so they're
with that,
huge. That's a huge part.
they are. That is a huge part. With that, we are going to wrap up Shop Talk for tonight. Thanks everybody for coming in, watching, and we will catch you next Monday. Same bat time, same bat channel. There.
All right, see you later.